Good morning. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're here with our Living in the Light fireside chats. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, dearest friend, Swami Kriyananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence so deeply within ourselves, as such a natural part of who we are, that effortlessly, joyously, without any sense of strain, we move through this world in harmony with your will. Keep us aware of our relationship with you. Keep us always aligned with your consciousness until gradually there is no boundary between us, but I and thou, myself and the divine, we live together as one seamless whole, for that is our true reality. Om, peace. Amen. Working my way through this and talking about attunement, I'm still on page 2 of this pamphlet, which has, I don't know how many pages. It only has 12, but we're only on page 2, so we're going to be busy for a while. I was reflecting on some of the things that I said yesterday, and afterwards a few other ideas came. So before I read further in, we were talking about, the benefit of those who try to share with others, those who try to serve, and that they gain the most who seek attunement with others more advanced than they themselves are on the path. And finally, that attunement is more important even than long hours of meditation without a corresponding effort to be in tune. It's not that the long hours of meditation are not beneficial, but if they're only, just a sec, we're going to have to try to clear our throat a little bit here. It's a very important distinction that Swami makes, because sometimes people meditate, and this was all based on actual examples that were in the community at the time he wrote that, where people are meditating because they're going to get self-realization. And there's enough words that you can find that Master spoke that can make you think that that's a good idea. Nothing matters. This world's a dream. I'm just going to meditate and I'm going to overcome delusion, without the thought of serving others, without the thought of sharing my life with others, without the idea that I need to try to be in tune with those who are more advanced than I am. I'm just going to meditate. Now, if you meditate, understanding that meditation itself, that the point of meditation is to get yourself in tune with a higher reality. It's not just to break through delusion, but that attunement can't be separated from your own self-realization, because we can't liberate ourselves. It's when the vibration of the Master comes in. St. John said, to all who received him. He didn't say to all of those who went into the cave and never came out. He said to all who received him. And see, these are the subtle nuances of the path that Swami in this pamphlet and in countless other ways is trying to get across to us. And I'm looking at it from the end of having been around for a lot of decades and having seen hundreds of people pass through Ananda, and see who stays, who doesn't, who gradually begins to shine, and whose light blazes and then diminishes, just like watching. Swami said one of the tremendous advantages of community, spiritual community, is it's a living laboratory. That we can watch people, our friends, we're not watching them like rats in a cage, but we're living with our friends, and we see the results of certain behaviors. You hold certain attitudes, what happens eventually? For that reason, it's interesting. I mentioned in some context that Ananda is a whole series of concentric circles, and the way it's grown is that many people come and go. They come as retreat guests or into the church or whatever they might do, or that they'll come and go, or they will remain active, dedicated, but on the periphery of 100% commitment. It could be, that's not even a criticism, it's just the karmically appropriate thing. And we have, these levels of commitment and involvement. We even have organized them into the sadhaka order and the sevaka order so that people can find a comfortable place for themselves. But there's a kind of gradual moving toward the center, and then there becomes a core group at the center that, for the most part, that core group, once a person commits there, they don't leave, even after many years. When we were involved in litigation in the 90s, at one point, we had to make a list of everybody. This was all just make work they gave us so that we would have to spend money and hopefully go bankrupt and give up. But we had to make a list of everybody who'd ever been a member of Ananda. And it was actually very interesting when I read through it, because everybody who wasn't still with us, well, many people were just peripheral and they just never really, but everybody who wasn't still with us, and I don't want this to sound arrogant or unkind, but it's just a fact. In every case, they'd held a certain attitude that because they were never able to quite give it up, eventually it had caused them, and the only word for it is to get out of tune. And I'm not even going to say out of tune with God, but just out of tune with what Ananda was doing. And whereas they'd had a deep dedication to it, they suddenly felt out of tune with it. And over the course of Ananda's history, and I was able to document this, I think I might have written this, I did write this in the Light Bearer book. It was pretty much every 5 years, something would happen that would force there to be a deeper understanding and a revised understanding, and in my way of thinking, always a more committed, more subtle, more, the path of, this is really a path of renunciation. And the vibration in the center would intensify, and those who had a wobble, that there was some wobble, some part that they just were holding out with a certain attitude, an attachment to money, a doubt about whether Swamiji really represented Master's work, a rebellion against the lifestyle in Ananda, too much emphasis on service, not enough emphasis on meditation, or more personal things like an attitude of always being a victim. Just one person that I knew, he always knew every unfair thing that had ever been done to him. I think he must have written them down. Just every time that there would be pressure, he would make a list of all the ways in which he'd been mistreated. And he just couldn't get over that. Or a kind of, worldliness. Just like, yes, it's nice being in the ashram, but there's a lot of good things going on, in the world too. And of course there are a lot of good things going on in the world too. But holding it as an attitude that says, at Ananda they don't really pay attention to these things, but I keep up because I think it's important to keep up. You may want to keep up with what's going on in the world. It's perfectly fine. It's not the doing of it, it's the attitude that gradually creates a wobble. And as you get deeper and deeper into the spiritual path, let me finish with the 5 years. And it was almost like every 5 years something would happen. That in very early on the temple burned down. The first one that I really know, in 1976, a lot of the community burned down. Oddly enough, let me think what would come out. And then Swami Kriyananda stopped being a monk. Then he wrote the Festival of Light. I think I enumerated all these at one point. Then he wrote the Festival of Light. Then we got sued by SRF. Then we got sued by Bertolucci. Then we were $3 million in debt because of the lawsuits. just one thing after another. And each one, as you get deeper and deeper into the realization, as Swami puts it in the path, of the magnitude of the revolution that Master is actually calling us to, anything that you're holding back in that intensity becomes more and more important. And also there's another factor, which is you move past the point where you can quote scripture or reason it out. It has to be a complete intuitive commitment that is based on not because I can make it all line up in my mind, but because this is mine and I know it. That was why when Jesus asked Peter if he was also going to leave him, Peter said, "Where would I go?" And that was the perfect answer, because Jesus was asking things of his people that didn't make any sense. And Peter didn't say that he understood it. He just said, "You belong to me, Lord. How could I leave you? Where in creation could I go except to be right here with you?" Master said, Master put it that when Jesus was testing his disciples in that way, and Master said at the end of his life, he tested his disciples in that way, made it harder and harder for people to be there. Swami remarked upon it, because Master knew he was about to leave, and he needed it to be strong. He could hold a lot of people together who may not have been that strong in themselves, but after his physical presence was gone, they needed to go on their way, and those left with the responsibility had to be unified enough that they could stand up to what was coming. The test was not whether the guru was really the guru. The test was whether the disciple trusted his own intuition in regard to his spiritual path. And that, the word for that is attunement. I'm attuned to this. This is mine. I mentioned yesterday about the steel cable that I felt that was going from me to Swamiji, that really was the truth of my spiritual life, even though there were a lot of emotional events and other things that happened. I was remembering afterwards a variation on that theme that was extremely vivid to me and really kept me attentive has kept me attentive ever since. I think it was after we published The Path, which would have been in the late 70s. And I say we because I was in charge of that project, and we worked really hard for about 4 months. Just basically, we didn't have work hours. We worked as much as we could work because we had a deadline to meet. It was a huge amount of work. That was before computers, and the simplicity of publishing was much more physically intensive to get a book ready for publication. You couldn't just do it on machine like you can now. And I was exhausted. And I went to visit my parents who lived in Los Angeles, and I usually would stay 3 or 4 days, not longer than that. But as soon as I got there, I came down very sick, and I got a very high fever, which is very unusual for me. I've gotten a high fever 2 or 3 times, maybe 3 times that I can remember in my whole life. It's just not something that happens to me. But in this case, I got the high fever. I remember lying in bed for a long period of time, just curled up in the fetal position. And it was extremely important that I stay in the fetal position, because if I relaxed and laid on my back and stretched out my arms and my legs, my 4 limbs would immediately separate from my body and just, run away. I would just be broken into multiple pieces. Only after I came out of that did I realize that was delirium. That wasn't like reason. But it was so true to me that I had to remain in the fetal position for I don't know how many hours or days. When I finally took my temperature, it was about 102, and it had come down to that. So God knows what I was going through. Anyway, it burned out, all of that, and I ended up being there with my parents for more days than I expected, and I was quite weak. I wouldn't eat. Couldn't eat. And I remember my mother being so worried about me. Mothers eat, she was insisting that I eat. And I remember accepting 1 strawberry and very carefully eating that 1 strawberry, and felt like I had just really participated in the human race and had fed myself. I say all of this because it was a strange time. I finally was well enough to be out of my bed. And I mean, it was just a flu or whatever it was. It came and went. It was a karmic moment. I was sitting there with my parents, as families do. We're watching television, you know, so you're kind of like birds on a wire, watching the television in front of us. And this thought was rising irresistibly in me to say out loud to my parents, you know, I think I'll just stay here. Do you mind if I just stay in the room here? I'm sure I can get a job around here. It would be nice to just sort of hang out with you for a while and just work like this. It was just like, this seems like a good idea. And I realized that if I said that out loud, my parents would be extremely happy to hear that. I was also dimly conscious that in some other reality, you know, where I come from, which is Swamiji and Ananda and all of that, there would be enormous consternation that Asha has decided to go live with her parents instead of come back, you know, to resume her life at Ananda. But in the moment, it seemed so sensible. I was there with my parents. They had this extra room. It was really comfortable. It was really nice being with them. I mean, I hadn't left Ananda with any concern, but in that environment, then I had this image. It was, I don't quite have visions, but my intuitions often, they're so vivid that I can see them. And it was a gossamer thread, and I spoke of the iron cable. This was a gossamer thread. It actually literally looked like a piece of a spider web because it was, you know, it was furry like this, and it waffled in the wind. And it went from where I was sitting in my parents' house in Los Angeles, it went right up to Ananda Village, and it was a link. I was still linked to Ananda Village, but there were demons, and the demons had their little hands on this wire. They were bouncing on it. They were trying to snap it. It was a very real thing. I was vulnerable on physically and therefore apparently mentally and emotionally, even though I wasn't aware of it. But I was vulnerable, and they were trying to snap that thread. And when I realized all of this, just sitting there watching television with my parents, you know, I forcefully repudiated that idea. Now, all of that is about attunement, because suddenly I was in another atmosphere which made perfect sense to me, and so the vibration of that atmosphere was just coming into me. And because I was physically weakened, it made more sense to me. You know, it's the familial warmth is what Master calls it in Autobiography of a Yogi, when he runs away to the Himalayas with his friend, and you know they're apprehended by their relatives, and even though they're being held by the police, the father or the brother of his companion is there, but Mukunda still wants to run away. But he speaks of his companion had lost his zeal for the adventure to go to the Himalayas. And Master uses the phrase, he was basking in the familial warmth. That's a really interesting phrase, and that's what I was doing. I was basking in the familial warmth. And why not? That's what the mind says, why not? You know, just like, yeah, Ananda's one place to live, but you could live in lots of places. You could do lots of things. Because what's happening at that point is we're falling out of tune. We're falling out of tune with the essential vibration of who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's that attunement with who I am spiritually, really literally, that gets us through those moments. It's not reason, it's not practicality, because reason can always give you an explanation of why this is a good idea. What causes us to drift away, and I've watched this. I remember one of the most, well, I had several over a period of a month that just seemed to be coming in the door. This one man comes to our temple, and I sort of look at him. He's familiar looking to me. He tells me his name, and I remember. He'd been with us, I don't know, 15 or 20 years before. He'd been very active, but then the demons bounced on the thread, and he drifted away. He told me that he'd had a very hard time in the intervening years. And he was looking back to the last time he was happy. And the last time he was happy was when he was with Ananda, so he's coming back looking for that again. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to hold it. Another man came. He had been at Ananda village. He'd been integral to what we were doing. He was a wonderful man. He got involved with this woman, and she was a fine woman, as Swami put it this way. She's a fine person, but she's not going to help him spiritually. And exactly that happened. She didn't really want to be there. She took him away. They had multiple children. I'm meeting him now. He stands in front of me again. You look familiar. Who are you? So he tells me, really, I have to say with so much sadness, he told me he had a corporate career. He raised his children. And there was nothing wrong. It was a perfectly fine life. But he was very sad. His eyes were very, very sad. And I remember when he left, and I remembered how Swami kept trying to persuade him to choose Ananda and not to choose that woman. Not that there was anything wrong with her, but she wouldn't help him spiritually, and he could see that. But he became more in tune with her vision of their life together than he was in tune with being part of what we were doing. Now, it's very subtle. And so that's why we have to think about it. And that's why I told the crazy story about a chandelier, which afterwards I thought, what in the heck am I talking about this? But it was an actual real example of flowing with the way that it is, not out of any weakness. But because if I try to be in tune with those who are more advanced than me, I'm building a familiarity of what attunement feels like, so that when other kinds of energy try to persuade me that I ought to follow them, I have a point of contrast. Because you see, it's very subtle. Once you lose that attunement with the family, with the path, with the spiritual family, with the path, you don't know that you've lost it. And that's why it makes it so, if I had said to my parents, I'm just going to stay here, just a whole lot of things could have cascaded down. They all might have worked out great. I could be a very wealthy person at this point, Many things could have happened. As we often joke, those of us who came to Ananda young have never optimized our earning potential. We've made other choices, and if that matters, there's lots of things I never optimized because I made other choices, but I was in tune with what I was doing. And by conscientiously always trying to be in tune, again, what does even that word mean? But there's a feeling of the flow and the importance of it. And, very difficult times are coming to our planet right now. And I've always thought of hard times in terms of, we're going to be hungry, we might be at war. I never considered a pandemic, but now I can talk about a pandemic. We're going to have wildfires, we're going to have bad weather, just like all kinds of things could happen, hard times. What a dummy. Of course, it's going to come inside the community. It's not going to be just an energy outside. It's going to be a subtle temptation to consider something else more important. People need to see this point of view, and especially nowadays when there's so much chaos about truth and integrity and what's really happening. It's very easy to just get drawn into all kinds of other thoughts, and I'm not even against that. Swamiji himself said, we live on this planet. It only makes sense to pay some attention to what's going on this planet. As he said, we do lots of things besides Kriya, so we might as well pay attention. But we always have to pay attention from a perspective of what are my true values, what are my true principles, what is more important than my relationship to my spiritual path. Is there something more important that is worth putting myself out of tune with what we're doing? I don't know how else to say that. And I'm not at all institutional in this. And I'm not at all saying that we should have a corporate point of view on issues that are totally unrelated to our spiritual path. The political world, the just everything. in everything in the external world, in a certain sense, is totally unrelated to our love for God and our spiritual path. But standing in our spiritual path, we get a certain relationship to things. And they don't, let's see. Well, I had this very strange moment. This was like 1989, no, 87 or 88. I think this is relevant. Oh, on Sunday service, we have this reading, which is a comparison between the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. And it's called Rays of the One Light or Rays of the Same Light. Now, I can't remember which. Whatever, the set of readings that we do now is the second iteration of that. The first iteration, which Swami did about 1986 or 87, was basically the same thing, but the readings were much longer. And we had to read them. We were expected to read them at Sunday service, but they were very long. Sometimes it would be 15 minutes of reading. Some of I was going to say the worst ones, but some of the worst ones were that long. We were starting here in Palo Alto, and I found those readings to be really, really difficult. It took so much time in the Sunday service. It was very hard for people to sit and listen to read words for that much time, and I totally rebelled against it. Swami knew they were too long, and eventually he rewrote it and made them much shorter. But that first year or so, I was just in total rebellion against having to read them. And he came to visit us in the house we were living in. We were living in Palo Alto, but we weren't in the community yet. There were a lot of other Ananda leaders there, and we had this discussion about my rebellion against these readings. And finally, Swamiji just said to the whole group, Asha doesn't have to use them. Asha doesn't have to use them. If she chooses not to, she doesn't have to use them. There was a bit of a kerfuffle. Well, if Asha doesn't have to use them, then all these people are not going to want to use them either, and they don't, have her experience, and it was just sort of like this. Swami said, "We'll just tell them that Asha's an exception. She doesn't have to use them," and they do. It was just very emphatic. He did this, but I could feel there was something really wrong. Here I had insisted and I got what I wanted. But there was something really wrong with what I was doing. And I remember just sort of a couple of more days. Swami's living in the house with us. Everybody's living in the house with us. So it just kind of keeps going for a day or two. I was in the kitchen, and it's just an odd, but again, this was a very visual. I'm holding a plate of remnants of a dinner plate, with still had some things on it. I needed to throw it away. I had a garbage can where you could step on the lid and step on a pedal and the thing flipped up. I'm standing there. I opened the garbage can. I'm looking at garbage like this. I have the plate in my hand. I'm scraping the garbage in. And just as clear as anything's been to me, if you accept this and set yourself apart from everyone else, you will leave the spiritual path. It was just that strong. It was like, this is what we're doing. I was perfectly justified, and Swami later changed the readings. I'll explain that in just a moment. But I scraped the plate, I dropped the lid, I walked in and said, "Swami, I'm not going to do that. I'll read them as long as everybody else is reading them." He just smiled, didn't say anything more. We never really talked about it, but it was an absolutely true moment. I had really good reasons for what I was doing, but it was putting me out of tune. And thank God, I wanted more to be in tune than I wanted to be allowed to do what I wanted to do in Sunday service. And now I'll just tell you funny things that happened. What happened finally was Swami published his commentary on the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And in order to bring attention to that book, it was I who suggested, why don't we read from the Rubaiyat every week on Sunday, Swamiji? We can do that for a year, and then everybody will really get involved in the Rubaiyat. He, smiling at me, knowing full well what I was doing. Yes, Asha, that would be a great idea. So we read from the Rubaiyat, and we sang the verses, and it was absolutely marvelous. And then it came time, and I said, let's do it for another year. We're just getting into this. Swami said, fine. And then we're coming to the end of the second year. I believe I have the timing right. And Swami starts rewriting the readings. And then, just so casually, he says, they've always been much too long. I've known they're much too long. You can't really read this much in a service. It doesn't work. We need much shorter readings. But he also referred to, at that time, there was no email, but there were fax machines. And when I sort of saw that we were coming up to the end of the Rubaiyat, we were going to have to go back to those readings, Swami referred to tear-stained faxes that he was getting from Asha, pleading with him not to make us all go back to those readings. Of course, the paper that comes out at the other end of the fax machine is not the one that I put on. But he loved telling people about the tear-stained faxes he got from Asha. And that's why he was writing this thing, and he wrote it fast enough, to make sure every week, and we never had to go back to the other. So you see, I wasn't wrong. And that's the point of it, you see. I wasn't wrong. I knew I wasn't wrong. But I was wrong because in order to be right on that small issue, I was literally in danger of losing everything. And that's why we have to practice attunement every way that it's offered to us. Because when those demons start bouncing on the thread, you want to make sure that you can tell that they're demons and not your friends. Okay? God bless you.